With that, I would like to bring up our keynote speaker this morning. As I mentioned, Bob Bendick is truly the heart and soul of the Network for Landscape Conservation. And I know Bob is a familiar face to everyone in the room. When we discussed who should kick us off this morning, it was a no-brainer. Absolutely had to be Bob, with his 20 years of service with the Nature Conservancy at present as director of the Gulf of Mexico program, and having served in many different capacities in the organization, including Director of U.S. Government Relations. I think it's also important to note, and I've picked up on this, when we're doing problem solving on a conference call, Bob always says, let's make sure that we get the state perspective into the mix, and I think that comes from his years of service also as a natural resources professional for the states of Nevada, my state, of New York, Bob, and also of Rhode Island. So that background, I think, gives Bob a really interesting perspective that he is going to share with us in his capacity of forum chair and co-chair. So thank you, Bob.
Thanks, Julie. It's pretty intimidating to see all of you out here. There's so much conservation knowledge in this room. I can't imagine that I'm going to add too much to it, but I'll give it a try. No PowerPoints, slides, an old-fashioned talk. So thanks, Julie, and let me add my welcome and thanks to our meeting sponsors and to all of you who have taken time out from your very busy lives to join us here. Thanks also to Emily Bateson, to Sean Johnson, Laramie Maxwell, to the program committee, to the authors of the white papers, and particularly to the panelists who have come to share their experience and knowledge with us. The purpose of my talk is to set the stage for these next 2 days. I will try to define landscape scale conservation, explain why it's so important, discuss the basic challenges to success and how organizations and groups of people from around the country are meeting those challenges. I'll also provide a short history of the network sponsoring this meeting and lessons learned so far. For years, I've imagined this scene. I am standing on a rocky ridge overlooking a green valley somewhere in North America. A river flows out of the mountains far to my right and through the valley. The river is flanked by marshes, meadows, and groves of small trees. There are hills in the distance. It is a warm spring afternoon with white clouds riding the wind. Large flocks of birds are visible below me. A pair of golden eagles circle above. I can see people moving slowly up the valley. They're walking in small groups. Some are pulling crude sleds piled with their few belongings. But they're not a band of Native Americans reoccupying their summer territory, nor are they European settlers. They are, I imagine, the first humans to venture here. They are just a few of them in a large landscape occupied only by elk and bear, and perhaps by the remnants of the giant fauna of the Ice Age, none of which have experienced the impacts of these new inhabitants. The people do not yet perceive the ability they have to shape the valley and the world beyond. They seem and probably feel small and weak compared to the power of their surroundings. I wonder what they're thinking. Are they grateful for this place they have found? Do they see it as theirs, as home, or as I expect, believe that they are just part of a vast and connected land, of range upon range of mountains and rivers flowing freely to destinations beyond the horizon, of herds of bison which, like the people, roam unfettered across the landscape? Now the land of this country has been occupied by 350 million successors of these first people. We have, of course, changed the land and water in many ways, not the least of which is to divide what once were whole natural features and systems into pieces. Some of these divisions are physical: roads, dams, fences, huge cities that are barriers to the passage of fish and wildlife. Other divisions are legal and organizational. Private ownerships, the boundaries of cities, towns, states, and counties, and the boundaries of undeveloped land managed by different agencies for different purposes. The practice of landscape conservation is about taking conservation action that includes bridging the physical, organizational, legal, and social barriers that divide areas of land and water. Barriers that diminish the benefits of the natural environment to people and to nature itself. Note that I say bridge, not erase those divisions. The land now will always be a patchwork of ownerships and jurisdictions that have their own historical, cultural, economic, and legal meaning to the diverse people of our country. Conservation action means public or private activities that save or restore the quality, character, and function of land, water, and natural habitats. And not just any old land and water, but land and water in areas defined by ecological relationships, watersheds, and other natural processes, and by social and cultural perceptions of place. Trying to define landscape conservation always raises questions of scale. How big is a landscape? Some suggest that the threshold of a large landscape is 500,000 acres in rural areas, but much smaller in metropolitan settings. From my perspective, the scale of landscapes can vary, and landscapes suitable for landscape conservation can nest within still larger landscapes. What is conservation at the land scale? Why is conservation at the landscape scale a useful thing to do? From a natural systems perspective, conservation biology reveals that under any conditions, plants and animals do much better if whole systems are protected and connected. Connected landscapes are more resilient to climate change than segmented ones at every scale and allow for species to migrate in response to sea level rise and changing temperatures. Conservation planning science shows that landscapes are effective units for defining what plant and animal communities should be conserved, for identifying the threats to those habitats and finding strategies to address those threats. And watershed scale planning is needed to restore connectivity in rivers and streams and to buffer aquatic systems from increasingly frequent floods and droughts. From a human perspective, planning and management at the landscape scale also makes sense. People depend on landscapes for farming, ranching, and forestry, for clean water, clean air, climate and flood resilience, tourism, and outdoor recreation, including fishing and hunting. Landscape scale thinking is important in metropolitan areas that often sprawl across ecosystems and depend upon them for water supplies, stormwater management, insulation from natural hazards, air quality, and outdoor recreation. Many landscapes have cultural or religious importance. Protecting their integrity can interpret our history, preserve the sacred spaces of Native American tribes, and provide a sense of place in the face of generic sprawling development. Coordinated landscape management of public lands is simply more cost-effective than disjointed and competing management within large areas. At a time of concern about the cost of government, ecosystem-based management reduces costs and improves results. An ecosystem or watershed-based planning can reconcile development and conservation interests and reduce conflict. Such planning is particularly useful for development of energy, water, and transportation infrastructure. For example, the recent approach to the siting of solar power facilities in the California desert has shown that regional analysis can identify the most ecologically important places to avoid and the least environmentally harmful places to build solar power generation. A regional view facilitates appropriate development and protects the environment. And finally, people have a strong perception and affinity for the watersheds or regions where they live and work, and given a chance will provide long-lasting support for activities to protect those places. While there is logic behind landscape-scale conservation, there are, as you know, many long-standing challenges to making it happen. The jurisdictional boundaries of the layers of government and the responsibilities of agencies that have developed over the years are part of the fabric of our society and are difficult to overcome. Some people are afraid that if a larger region is used as the frame of reference, they will have less say in determining the future of their property, their communities, and economic activities. We are affected by changing baselines. For example, no one in the Northeast and South now alive remembers the great migrations of fish upstream to spawn in rivers long dammed for industrial purposes, so they don't recognize the value of restoring the connections that have been lost. Money to support landscape-scale planning and cooperation is, according to the recent survey of the practitioners' networks from around the country conducted by the network and distributed to you in advance, an essential ingredient for landscape conservation, but it is always in short supply. These challenges to landscape conservation are made more acute by the polarization of our politics and the divisions within our society. Scientific advances in conservation and biology and forest management are obscured by politicized public discourse. The conflict around climate change is particularly dysfunctional for landscape conservation. Despite these problems, there is a growing momentum around efforts to plan and accomplish conservation at the landscape scale. As the survey reveals, the number of these efforts is accelerating, with almost half having been started since 2010. Here are just a few examples of both older and newer projects. When Yellowstone Park was created, it seemed that those 3,500 square miles were adequate to protect the park's natural assets. But 100 years later, nonprofit organizations and government agencies realized that the Yellowstone ecosystem was actually much larger, and that cooperative management of other publicly and privately owned land was needed to protect the ability of far-ranging animals to find habitat for their survival. Scientists and advocates have now further expanded the scope of planning and action to advance the Yellowstone to Yukon conservation corridor. In New England, land trusts are working together with help from the Highstead Foundation to create regional conservation partnerships that span their individual territories. Nearly 50 years ago, seeing the decline in water quality in Lake Tahoe, the states of Nevada and California created the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency to lead a cooperative effort to preserve, restore, and enhance the environment of the Lake Tahoe region. The agency is now accelerating its efforts through new levels of citizen and government engagement. In the Blackfoot Valley of western Montana, ranchers began cooperating in the 1970s to retain the unique character of the place where they live. The Blackfoot Challenge continues to use a combination of conservation easements, strategic additions to public land, cooperative management, and a lot of great informal discussion to protect the agricultural, recreational, and scenic values of the valley. As you will see in the film and discussion this evening, the people of the High Divide region of Idaho and Montana are working together on cooperative landscape scale planning in another magnificent Western landscape. Individual communities and conservation organizations across the Chicago metropolitan area are maintaining a network of open space to recover some of the region's original habitat and to provide opportunities for outdoor recreation. 49 national heritage areas have been created across the country to protect and educate people about natural, historic, and cultural landscapes, and to stimulate the economic renewal of these places. While these are federally designated, they have come entirely from the bottom up, locally driven initiatives. The regional associations of state fish and wildlife agencies have established projects to conserve habitat across state lines, like the Regional Conservation Needs Program in the Northeast and the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. And in 2009, the Secretary of the Interior established a system of landscape conservation cooperatives to provide a forum for states, tribes, federal agencies, non-governmental organizations, and universities to work together on conservation data management and planning. The Network for Landscape Conservation has identified at least 300 landscape conservation projects across North America that similarly vary in scope, governance, and purpose. With the increase in landscape scale projects and initiatives, some of the participants began sharing lessons learned from their successes and failures, and came to believe that there should be a more formal way to accomplish that sharing. In 2011, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy sponsored a meeting at which 19 groups resolved to create a more formal practitioners network for large landscape conservation, staffed by Matt McKinney, Sean Johnson from the University of Montana, and Gary Tabor at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. The network began to exchange information, and then in 2014 joined with the Lincoln Institute, the Chesapeake Conservancy, the LCC Network, the American Fisheries Society, and many other partners in sponsoring a 2-day meeting in Washington in which over 700 people participated in an enthusiastic exchange of conservation information. This outpouring of interest convinced us of the need for a more robust organization to both support and help advance the field. And so now the renamed Network for Landscape Conservation, with continuing help from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, has a small staff headed by Emily Bates and a website and a variety of action initiatives, one of which is this forum. That is designed for a wide range of interests to create a direction forward for large landscape conservation. What have we learned from all this so far? We'll hear much more from the speakers and panelists, but here are a few broad lessons. There's not just one way to go. There is no one formula for success for conservation of landscapes. The structure and process should fit the culture and character of the places themselves and the problems to be solved. Collaboration and from the bottom-up processes are essential in today's world, but it takes a great deal of time and energy to do collaboration right. Durability is a key element of success. Every one of the examples I've cited envisions decades of work, and for such efforts to remain successful, they need continuing sources of funding and steady leadership. Yes, determined and persistent individual local leaders can make a profound difference in the fate of their landscapes. The science of conservation biology has advanced to provide critical guidance to decision-making, but we must find more effective ways of communicating that science to guide action on the ground at multiple scales. And finally, landscape conservation involves the heart as well as the mind. We should not be afraid of recognizing the spiritual and cultural values of the landscapes we hope to conserve. I'm again standing on the point of rock overlooking the valley. It is a warm spring afternoon with white clouds riding the wind. But 10,000 years have passed. They've not always been easy either on the land or the people. But now there is a city downstream to my left. The city is surrounded by parks, one of which includes the overlook where I'm standing. The river has a wide, protected floodplain and groves of cottonwoods and patches of willows, and a broad marsh extends to the west. A bicycle and hiking path follows the river. There are a few villages scattered across the valley. Wind turbines rise above the land, and farms and ranches thrive between me and the distant hills. In the managed mountain forests that protect the city's water supply, it is still possible to see bear and elk and hear the cry of the mountain lion. And beyond, at the headwaters of the river, there is wilderness. Of course, I understand that this is an idealized vision, that there still will be environmental and human problems in that future valley, but I imagine it to be a good place to live for people, plants, and animals. It could have been otherwise, but it was saved not because some higher power demanded it, but because after 10,000 years, the people came of age. They realized the value of nature and how good science and the diverse views of citizens can work constructively together. In the face of widespread degradation of their environment, they found a way to reach back across time to see through the eyes of those first awestruck inhabitants and the tribes who followed them. In doing so, they rediscovered the importance of connections that would allow fish to swim upstream, give sandhill cranes a place to land in their annual migrations, and connections to the land that allowed their children to experience the magic of nature on spring afternoons. And through their sharing of this place and others like it, they found sufficient common ground and connections to each other to begin to bridge their other differences. I've been at this long enough to be absolutely certain that this kind of future is possible. We are gathered here on this autumn day because we share hope for such success and a conviction that achieving that success is not someone else's responsibility. It is up to all of us to show the way. We should look forward eagerly to the challenge and to meeting that challenge as companions on a continuing conservation journey. As the shadows reach across the valley, a pair of golden eagles circle beneath the clouds and head north to the mountains from which the river flows. Thank you.